I just want to mention a few things to start with. My name is Jessica, and yes, that is my real name, but I won't say my full name due to obvious reasons. I come from a military family, with my granddad serving in Vietnam and my dad serving in Operation Desert Storm as an M2 Bradley fighting vehicle gunner. Naturally, I was always interested in the military and all things surrounding it. I've never had any family members injured during service, so I really didn't have anything holding me back, except for the fact that I was a girl. There wasn't many girls around during my granddad's time, as women were not drafted for the Vietnam War, but my dad had some pretty disturbing stories from his time in the Army regarding women, mostly the usual, sexual assault type stuff. This always made me sit on the fence as to whether I should join, given that I was a pretty attractive 19-year-old girl before I joined. The thing that made me sign up, like most Americans during this time, was the 9/11 attacks on America. I still remember watching the events unfold live in front of me in my family home living room as we watched the Twin Towers fall in horror. Literally, the next day I went to my local Army recruitment center and signed up. At the time, I didn't realize this, but the 20-something-year-old recruiter was hitting on me the whole entire time I was in there. He wasn't bad looking, but just not my type. I do remember getting slightly frustrated at him since he took ages to process everything through, probably to get time to talk to me for as long as possible. Anyway, it all happened so fast and I was filled with so much hatred that I just signed whatever the hell they gave me and hoped to be in basic training as soon as possible. Fast forward just over a week or so, and I found myself on the bus to basic training. It all seemed really fast to me, even in the heat of the moment. I didn't know this at the time, but I was processed through the system at an abnormally fast rate, even faster than what I thought. I just assumed it was due to the high demand after the attacks. Anyway, for the first few days no one really spoke to each other, and not many people even paid attention to me or the fact that I was a girl, apart from the drill sergeant. I was the only girl in my unit, so I would always notice him watching me, and almost me exclusively, especially during any sort of physical activity or first aid training. Maybe 3 weeks into training, everyone becomes a lot more comfortable with one another, and I really felt like I was becoming one of the boys. I never had any issues with anyone apart from the sergeant, who would keep making comments like, "Oh, you know how to handle a weapon well for a girl." One time I got fed up of being bullied and spoke back to the sergeant saying that my dad is in the military and he taught me. This didn't sit well with him, and he told me he wants to see me in his office at the end of the day, or else it's PT for the whole unit tomorrow. I had no choice, and reluctantly turned up at his office around 7:30 p.m. When he told me to come in, he was talking to someone I didn't recognize, who he shortly gave a nod to as if a signal to leave. The guy complied and gave me a quick glance on the way out. Sergeant sat me down and explained the usual boring stuff, that my behavior was unacceptable, and he's ashamed because I'm a good recruit. But what he said next made my eyes widen and my heart skip a beat. "Oh, and one more thing. If you don't want the situation getting escalated, you're going to have to do me a favor," he said smugly. Favor, I thought. "You're going to do exactly as I say, Jessica. The door is locked, so don't think about running, and if you make too much noise, I'm escalating the situation anyway." In an instant, my body got overrun with fear. I froze for a second and knew that there was no way I could ever get out of this situation. I knew exactly what he wanted from me. My dad's nightmare stories had come true, and that guy was definitely in on it. He must have been the one that locked the door. At that very moment, I realized that I had entered a corrupt system and there was nothing I could do. But I wasn't going to get kicked out of the Army, so unfortunately, I had to comply. I will spare you the details, but we ended up having sex, and not the kind you would have with your boyfriend. After it was done, I left the office and went straight to my bunk and silently cried myself to sleep. For the next few weeks, he left me alone, but I was still scarred and told nobody about what happened. When people asked, I just told them that he just did the usual slandering and verbal BS and that I'm fine. Although he did leave me alone, the comments and staring did not stop. I tried to ignore it as much as I could and focus on becoming a good soldier. I couldn't forget the reason why I came here. One thing I found strange, however, was the fact that the guy I saw in the office has been popping up here and there ever since that interaction. I didn't recognize him, but he seemed to recognize me. Somehow I just felt it. Come week 5 and I get invited into the sergeant's office again because he wants to speak to me about something important. After what happened last time, I'm expecting the very worst. As I get closer and closer to his office, my heart beats faster and faster and fear begins to wash over me again. I get to the door and before I could knock, the strange guy opens the door and lets me in. Weird because there weren't any windows in the office, so I'm not sure how he knew I was there. Maybe he heard me? That's what I thought at the time. Anyway, I kind of stood in the doorway for a bit and looked at the guy and Sergeant at the desk in an analytical way, hoping to predict their intentions. "Come in," he said. I went inside, sat down, and the door was closed behind me. I could feel the presence of the guy looming over me as I sat in the chair. "So, I've noticed you are doing exceptionally well in training. We've all noticed. I would like to congratulate you and tell you to keep up the good work. If you do, I will make sure to put in a good word for you so that you may get your desired designation role and get special treatment. How does that sound?" This really caught me off guard as he seemed friendly this time. I was still suspicious, but a little less this time. I told him that yes, that's great and I'd love that. But that was it. He dismissed me and I went about my day. From then he seemed to stop the sexist comments, treated me a lot better and didn't give me problems. Maybe someone higher up found out about what he did. Anyway, I was not complaining for sure. I asked around the boys if they knew the other suspicious guy, but no one seemed to recognize him. I found this strange since I was under the impression that, important or not, everyone knew everyone in the military. I was curious to the point where I even asked the drill sergeant one time, and he simply said that it's an old friend of his. This friend never spoke to me or anyone in the unit. He was just kinda there, observing. Things looked up for me since the conversation, to the point where during the last week of training, the drill sergeant invited me to a party with him and some other higher-ranking guys and girls. I wasn't sure at first because of what happened in We3, but the fact that girls were mentioned made me feel a lot more reassured and safe about the whole thing. And when he mentioned alcohol, I was totally bought. I liked to drink in my civilian life, but drinking was strictly prohibited in the Army, so I felt really special when they invited me. So I agreed. The night of the party arrived swiftly and I was super excited. Sergeant told me that it would take place in an unused barrack a few hundred meters from out regular ones, so that's exactly where I went. Bedtime was 9 p.m. for everyone, so I felt really special that the party is at 9:30, which got me even more excited. I approached the old rundown barrack and was greeted by the sergeant and some other guy that I got to know as Colonel. I won't say his real name, but let's just call him that. As I entered the barracks, I saw that there was a table lined with booze and about 10 other guys there, but no girls. I brought this up with Sergeant and he simply said that they couldn't make it tonight. That should have been the first and only red flag that got me out of there. But, enticed by the booze and promise of an easy Army life, I proceeded inside and grabbed my first drink. I slowly got to know everybody there and soon noticed that Sergeant's old buddy was there too. I took my chance and approached him, asking who he was. He told me the exact same thing that Sergeant told me, that he's his old friend. The only thing was, this guy seemed a good 10 years younger than the sergeant, so how exactly did they become friends? I asked him this and he avoided the question and told me to get another drink and enjoy the night, so I did. My second and worst mistake of all was letting the boys hype me up into drinking more and more, to the point where I could barely stand on my own. It was mainly Sergeant doing this, but since he was my sergeant, I didn't want to disappoint him, so I listened. That's all I remember from that night, unfortunately. I wish I could tell you what happened next, but I blacked out. All I remember is waking up on my bunk in the morning with my trousers undone. They were on, but they were not done up all the way. The very first thought that came to my mind was, oh my God, I got taken advantage of once again by that creep. I tried telling myself that maybe it was just the case because I got hot and undid my top button. But that theory went out the window when I saw Sergeant that morning and saw that damn smirk of his as we locked eyes. He did it again. He fucking did it again. I was sure of it. It had gone too far now, so I stormed towards him and prepared to confront him in front of everyone. Just as I approached, the creepy guy turned the corner and stood between us. In a lowered voice, he said, "If you mention anything about last night, you're so fucked. And if you're wondering who I am, maybe the fact that I know your grandpa served in the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry will ring a bell." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was speechless. but I now knew exactly who this man was. The only person I remember telling this to was the recruiter from back when I signed up. I remember this conversation vividly, as I can recall him being very interested in my family since I told him they're military. Reality hit me like a truck when I realized that this guy knew everything about me and probably fucking followed me here. That's why nobody knew who he was or what the hell he is doing here. He was here for me and he got to me through this fucking corrupt system. I knew I had to get out as soon as possible. I wanted to be a soldier, but not to the point where I would be used like this. Without saying a word, I walked over to the clinic and asked to see the psychologist. Against the recruiter's advice, I told the psychologist everything that happened. He didn't seem to believe me at first, but when I completely broke down crying, he did. He said that since there isn't any evidence and I want to get out, they can offer me entry-level separation, which is where they withdraw you from training. I took the offer without skipping a beat and was out of there the next day. On the way out, I saw a sergeant standing by the gate and eyeing me down one last time, as if to get one more good look at me before he never sees me again. As soon as I retrieved my stuff and was out, I called my dad and told him to pick me up. I told him everything and he promised to go and take it up with them personally and deal with the matter appropriately tomorrow. Days passed, and I went back to my regular job I was working at before. The situation still lingered in the back of my mind, and I didn't know if I'd ever get over it. I worked as a waitress at the time at this mid-level restaurant, and on one of the shifts when I was in the back clearing up some plates, one of my coworkers comes up to me and says that these two guys came in asking about me. We had this small gap in between the door and the wall that led from the restaurant into the back that was big enough to peek through. We would use it sometimes to laugh at customers or spy on people. Anyway, I approached the gap, and what I saw made my stomach tighten into a knot. It was Sergeant and his buddy. How the fuck did they find me? Were they stalking me? I quickly retreated from the gap. I knew this had gone too far, and my coworker, noticing that I'm startled, asked if I know them. I said yeah, and explained the situations to her briefly. She didn't know what to say but offered to call the police. I knew that calling the police would not do anything as there was no proof. But maybe if I could provoke him in front of all these customers, I could get him in trouble. So against all instinct, I went out from the back and confronted them. Sergeant then leaned over and said to me, "You're going to tell your friends you're going out for some fresh air and you're going to come with me. You will get in my car without saying a word, and we will go from there. Understood? Don't test me." I could sense his anger, so I knew this was my time. I was wearing heels, so I discreetly stepped onto his foot. He let out a pretty loud groan and in a matter of milliseconds hit me square across the face. I fell backwards and stumbled into another customer. This was exactly what I wanted. Everybody in the restaurant that saw this erupted in a rage and disgust seeing this guy hit a girl. Sergeant and Buddy tried to run out, but these four guys that sat at a table next to the entrance stopped them dead in their tracks. This was 2001, so people actually stepped in for strangers, especially women. Long story short, they were held down until the police arrived. And despite Sarge telling the police who they were, the cops were forced to arrest them due to the overwhelming amount of witnesses. I gave my statement and offered to come to the police station to give a formal report of everything that happened to me during basic training too. After I told them this, they informed me that this sergeant was actually on his last straw. Apparently, there had been a mountain of complaints against this guy over the last 10 years or so. They said they could never do anything because everything was committed on Army property, but now that he assaulted me in the restaurant, they have a reason to launch an investigation. They assured me that he would be locked up along with that buddy of his. It's been the better part of 20 years now, and I haven't had any issues with those guys since. But I guess the moral of the story is to always trust your gut. But also, if you're a woman, think twice about joining the Army. You're just not completely safe anywhere.